Hello there, you're watching CNN Money Switzerland. Today we're looking at megatrends and how they've been impacted by coronavirus. Today we're looking at diversity. I'm Hannah Wise, and joining me here is Annahita de Mare, who is an author of children's books that aim to smash the diversity crisis. Annahita, welcome along. For me, we talk a lot about diversity in business, but I'm guessing that this issue is very important long before we get to the boardroom.
Absolutely, you're absolutely correct, yeah. So I have written a series of books about three cousins who are from a mixed heritage family who go on adventures in a hot air balloon. And the whole point of these books was to have a simple, really fun set of adventure series where the characters were not all white, which is a little bit of a problem in children's books at the moment.
So what kind of diversity are you aiming at here? Is it race diversity,
So it's
gender?
two specific things. So the main focus is actually about gender diversity, or at least smashing the traditional stereotypes that you tend to see in the media, in children's programmes and a lot in children's books, of girls being very often princesses or fairies or butterflies or very sort of gentle, meek creatures. I wanted to see a little bit more of an exciting, inspiring, relatable characters that are getting out and exploring the world, enjoying themselves, really being active, which is not something that you see very often in books. But the other part of it is also about having better representation in children's books. So particularly over the last, it's not new that we have a diverse population, right? So it really shouldn't be a new thing. But in the last 20, 30 years, children's books have been very much white or animals. In fact, you will tend to find more animal characters than you'll find a black, an Asian or a minority ethnic character in a children's book.
Can you give us some statistics on this? I mean, how serious is the issue?
So in 2018, the Centre for Literacy and Primary Education published a report called the Reflecting Realities Report. And they went through all of the children's books that were published in 2017. And there was around about 10,000 books, a little under 10,000 books. And of those books, 4% of those books had a BAME, so Black, Asian or minority ethnic character, and only 1% had a BAME character that was in the lead of that story, so not just in the background. 1%. And if you imagine, certainly in the UK, 35% of school-aged children identify as BAME, so that's extremely underrepresented.
What kind of impact then does that have on a child to be given a stereotype?
Well, if you think about it, if you read a book and you see a character in there, and especially if you read books of children, they very often point at a character and go, oh, that's me. Oh, yeah, I'm like that person. Whereas if you go through your whole childhood reading stories where you don't see yourself reflected back in the pages, I think that's, firstly, that's very damaging. Secondly, for children, white children as well, for example, who are reading books that only have other white children in them, how are they to understand when we always say we are equal, everybody deserves to be seen, everybody deserves to be a part of the story? How are they to believe that when then you don't see anybody else in your stories?
You're based in Switzerland, but obviously you've lived in various countries, and you just gave a statistic from the UK. What is your experience here?
So here in Switzerland, there haven't been any specific studies in that area. However, there was an article a couple of years ago in the Tagesanzeiger which was based on this UK Reflecting Realities report, where they were talking about the fact that the situation here is very similar. I myself went into my local library and I went through the 400 picture books that they had, literally each single one, and I counted how many books had a character that would identify as BAME. And of these nearly 400 books, there were 7 books that had a character that had black or brown skin. And Switzerland as well is, okay, I moved from London to a small village in Switzerland, so it's not exactly comparing apples with apples, but Switzerland is also diverse. We have many nationalities, even in our very small village school. And these children, everybody needs to be seeing themselves in children's books to validate themselves.
You started reading, in fact, to children in schools, both English-speaking schools and German-speaking schools.
That's right.
What kind of need for this is there? I mean, do you see cultural differences between English speakers and German speakers?
It's an interesting question, going slightly off topic from diversity, but also related to reading. In the UK, reading for pleasure has been a really big focus point over the last perhaps 10 years or so. And if you're, as an author, you phone up a school in England and say, I'm an author, I'm nearby, would you like me to come and do a visit? They will absolutely jump at the opportunity. And however, here in Switzerland, it's not quite so popular a thing for authors to go into schools. It certainly happens, particularly in the cities, but it's not quite as popular. And it's interesting that reading for pleasure also doesn't seem to be a huge focus point here in Switzerland. And in the PISA report in 2018, there was Switzerland was actually in, I think, 27th place for reading comprehension, whereas the UK was up in 10th place. But if you look back to 2012, the UK was in 24th place and Switzerland was in 14th place. So there's been a sort of almost like a trading of places. And it does make me wonder whether this drive to encourage reading for pleasures in schools and in homes has had a little bit of a impact on that. That is, of course, going a little bit away from the diversity story.
But essentially, you are calling for more action in this direction here in Switzerland.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the nice things with the Swiss education system is it tends to start a little bit later for children than it does, for example, comparison to the UK. So children will be starting to read and write on average probably about 2 years earlier in the UK than here. Whereas here, actually, when you learn to read a little bit later, it actually comes a lot easier as well because you're ready for it, so you don't have to work so hard at it. So it becomes more pleasurable for children anyway. But because of that, I think it makes it even more important to encourage this love of reading early on, which the OECD has said that reading is actually one of the biggest success factors for children, even more so than socioeconomic background. So it is a very, very, very important topic. And again, bringing it back to the point about diversity, if children see themselves in the stories that they're reading, they're far more interested to read them than if it's always about what feels like other people.
You're self-published. Why did you decide to go it alone?
So this, as I said earlier, it's not a new thing that populations are diverse. It's always been the case, or at least for a very, very long time. Yet the statistics in publishing haven't really changed. In a good 10 years, they've been doing studies about representation in books, and that hasn't really changed that time. I felt like it was ever so slow moving. And the general timeline to publish traditionally is once you've found an agent, which can take a number of months, then they need to find publishers, which will take a number of months. Eventually, the book comes to market probably around 2 years after you've written it. I was ready, and I wanted these books. I wanted these books for my children. I wanted these books out there now. I didn't want to wait any longer until the industry would finally catch up to this problem of diversity. So I stormed ahead and did it myself.
So you think that publishers themselves aren't as concerned as they should be about diversity?
They definitely haven't been. This year has, I think, been a bit of a wake-up call for publishers. So particularly in June, there was an explosion on social media of people interested in diverse children's books. The hashtag diverse children's books just over a series of a week just absolutely exploded. And a number of fantastic books that have been published in the UK by Black authors and illustrators went out of stock almost immediately, and the publishers had to back order because suddenly people were realising it is so important to have representation, to have a bookshelf that represents everybody, not just a small subset of the community.
But will the Black Lives Movement campaign have a long-lasting impact?
I hope so. I must admit that I notice myself with my books right at the peak in June that sales certainly went up high, and then it already tapered off very quickly. So it is a slight worry to me that it will become one of those things where it's a short trend for people. Having said that, as I mentioned before, the publishing timelines are quite long. So now publishers are going to be going out and seeking own voices, so Black people, Asian people, people who are actually writing stories from their own perspectives. They're really starting to realise how important this is. So if that process has started now, that should then ensure that then continues to impact then on the books that are published in a couple of years' time.
And of course, we also lived through, or are still living with, coronavirus. How did that impact the sales of your books and reading habits?
Actually, for me, it was a bit of a positive thing, which felt a little bit selfish. But yes, so people were certainly reading a lot more books in lockdown. Sales of books went really quite, from my personal perspective, I noticed that the sales of books did increased quite rapidly. Especially I write stories about travelling across the world in a hot air balloon to remote places where you don't see any people. That was obviously a very, very hot topic at the time when people are stuck in their living rooms. For me as well, it was a bit of an introduction to things like online readings, on live YouTube videos, which are a few things that I taught myself in the period. And people were really interested in that sort of thing. So it's really quite great. But as I say, it felt a little bit uncomfortable to some extent that I was experiencing the success when everybody else is really suffering quite badly. So I did donate all of my profits from that period to the Save the Children Coronavirus appeal.
And what about real life heroes? I mean, do children have real role models that they should look up to?
Absolutely. And from adult females as well, there's been a huge explosion of non-fiction books about adult females from history who have achieved incredible things, which is really great because the school system has in the past tended to focus on men. So I'm really happy to see that. But there are also some amazing children out there. If you think about Sky Brown, she's 8 years old, Japanese, and she was the first to compete professionally in skateboarding. And this child is amazing. She's absolutely incredible. And she was supposed to be competing in the Tokyo Olympics, I believe, at 12 years of age. There's Sailor Schneider, who climbed El Capitan in Yosemite at 10 years of age. There's
so your stories are realistic then?
Well, this is it. So the Sailor Schneider one was a particular one that I looked at because the fourth book in my series is about these three cousins flying to the Eiger to climb the North Face, which is notorious for being quite a difficult mountain to climb. And I thought, is this really realistic? Am I really pushing the boundaries here? And so I was researching to see how good can children actually climb? And I saw this and I thought, right, I need to take my children climbing immediately.
Wonderful. And what's next for you then? I mean, if you're smashing diversity when it comes to gender and race, what's next?
So I think for me, that's still going to be my focus areas. I think there are other facets of diversity that really need to be better represented in children's books.
Like what?
So disabled, for example, you'll very rarely find a child in a wheelchair in the main character leading a story of a book, or a child that uses a cane, or perhaps a deaf child. There's so many different facets. Neurodiversity as well. There really should be more children with ADHD or autism or dyslexia in children's books. Again, so that children feel seen in their books. One of the ways that you can really encourage children to love reading and carry on loving reading is when they start to see themselves in the stories that they're reading. But I think it's also really, really important that we're encouraging own voices in this area. So it's difficult for me to write a story about a child who goes through life in a wheelchair, because that's not an experience that I or my children have had. It's more important and more authentic if that story is told from an own voice perspective.
And the work that you do you think it will eventually impact the business issues that we have currently today, where there are not enough women in business in high-level jobs? Absolutely.
If you look, there was a study a number of years ago where I think it was in Canada, where they took with 5, 6 and 7-year-old children, they sat them down and they described a character, somebody who was very good at work, they were very smart, they did their work particularly well, they were well respected, and then they laid out photos for them to look at and ask them to pick who that person was. And at 5 years of age, the children were just picking someone that was the same gender as them, because that's what they identified most with. 6 years of age, girls were already starting to choose men over women. They were starting to lose the confidence in their own gender's brilliance at 6 years of age, which is really concerning. So I think it's extremely important to start young with these messages, because we quite often, if you look at many of the popular TV shows for children, or many of the toys that you tend to get for children, it's very often divided already at a very young age. Girls are encouraged to play with dolls and boys are encouraged to play with Lego. And particularly from the marketing from these countries, marketed in this way. Even Lego, for example, you've got Lego and you've got Lego Friends. And there's a Ninjago and all these different, and there's a huge difference between the roles that these Lego characters are playing, the things that are being built. Somebody bought my children a beauty salon to build with Lego friends, whereas when we'd gone to a birthday party recently, we'd bought someone building a ship, which seemed to me a whole lot more exciting than building a beauty salon. But so I think it's really, really important that books and toys, but I think it starts quite often with books, to have much better role models that are relatable, that children can look at and say, oh yeah, she's a bit like me, but they're pushing themselves to the limits and they're encouraging each other. It's not just one individual hero, it's girls working together to encourage each other to dream big and reach their goals.
Annahita de la Mare, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, well, remember you can catch up with all our summer series content by checking out our website. We're at cnnmoney.ch, and you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn and Twitter. Bye-bye.